The anchor on your screen right now would sink for nearly 30 minutes before it touched the bottom, and when it finally did, it wouldn't hook into anything. Because in deep water, anchors don't grip the seafloor, they disappear into it. By the end of this video, you'll never look at a ship sitting still in the middle of the ocean the same way again. What you think is holding it there is almost certainly wrong. And the real answer involves physics so counterintuitive that it took engineers decades and several catastrophic failures to figure it out. Let's start with the scale, because without it, nothing else makes sense. The world's oceans average over 12,000 feet deep. The deepest point, Challenger Deep, drops nearly 36,000 feet. But you don't need extreme depth to expose the problem. At just 1,000 feet, shallower than many offshore oil fields, a conventional anchor system becomes essentially useless. We're talking about vessels the size of city blocks, carrying billions of dollars in equipment, drilling into the seafloor in conditions that would throw a truck off a highway. These ships cannot move, not even slightly. A drift of just a few meters can shear a drill pipe, rupture a wellhead, or trigger a blowout. The stakes are measured in human lives and environmental disasters, and yet, somehow, these ships stay precisely, almost impossibly, still. Most people assume it works the same way it did for ancient sailors. A heavy metal hook drops to the bottom, digs into the sand, and holds the ship like a tent peg holds a rope. Heavier anchor, deeper grip, stronger hold. That's the intuition. That's what almost everyone believes. But that's not the real reason anchors work, even in shallow water. Here's what's actually happening. A traditional anchor doesn't hold a ship through weight or hooking force alone, it holds it through geometry. The anchor chain, or rode, lies flat along the seafloor in a long horizontal curve. When the ship pulls, it's not yanking the anchor upward, it's pulling it sideways along the bottom. The anchor digs in not because it's heavy, but because the angle of the pull keeps it buried. The chain itself, lying across the seabed, absorbs the load. The system only works because of that horizontal geometry, and this is where things get interesting, because in deep water that geometry breaks down completely. Think about it. If your water depth is 10,000 feet, and you want that chain to lie flat on the bottom, you need an enormous amount of chain, sometimes 5 to 7 times the water depth. That's 50,000 to 70,000 feet of heavy steel chain. The weight of that chain alone would exceed the structural limits of most vessels. The cost would be staggering. And even if you could carry it, the time to deploy and retrieve it would be measured in days, not hours. The whole system collapses under its own logic. Engineers learned this the hard way. In the early days of offshore oil exploration in the 1960s and 70s, the industry simply tried to scale up what worked in shallow water. Bigger anchors, more chain, heavier everything. Ships dragged, rigs drifted, drill strings snapped. One North Sea platform in the 1970s experienced anchor system failures so severe during a storm that it became the quiet catalyst for an entirely new field of engineering. The loss wasn't just equipment, it was a signal. The old model was fundamentally broken. So engineers went back to first principles, and they asked a different question. Instead of, how do we hold a ship still, they asked, what does holding a ship still actually require? The answer, when you strip everything away, is force balance. The ship wants to move, pushed by wind, current, and wave. You need an equal and opposite force to keep it stationary. In shallow water, that force comes from chain geometry and anchor grip. In deep water, you have to generate that force a completely different way. The first solution was spread mooring, a web of anchors deployed in multiple directions like the legs of a spider, each one fighting a different drift vector. Instead of one anchor holding the bow, you might have 8 to 12 anchors spread in a circle, each pulling the ship toward a different point of the compass simultaneously. The tensions cancel out. The ship floats at the center, held not by any single grip but by the equilibrium of competing forces. But here's the twist. Even spread mooring has a depth ceiling. Beyond a certain point, roughly 3,000 to 5,000 feet depending on conditions, the sheer length of mooring lines introduces a new problem: elasticity. Long steel cables stretch, they store energy like a spring, and when a wave releases a ship upward and the cable snaps taut again, the shock load can be violent enough to part the line. Engineers responded by switching from steel wire to synthetic fiber rope, materials like polyester or high-modulus polyethylene, which have controlled elasticity, absorbing shock instead of transferring it. The mooring line becomes a tuned mechanical spring, not just a tether, and that's only half the story. Because beyond even these depths, anchoring becomes physically impractical no matter what material you use. The lines get too long, the seafloor geology gets too unpredictable, and so the industry arrived at a solution so elegant it seems like it shouldn't work. Don't anchor at all. Dynamic positioning, or DP, is the system that holds the world's most advanced drill ships and floating platforms in place today. There are no anchors, no chains, no lines. Instead, the ship is wrapped in a ring of thrusters, propellers pointing in every direction, and connected to a computer system that reads GPS, acoustic beacons on the seafloor, wind sensors, and motion detectors hundreds of times per second. When the ship begins to drift even slightly, the system fires the appropriate thrusters to push it back. The ship is not held still. It is continuously corrected back to still, thousands of times a minute. It's the difference between a tent peg and a tightrope walker. One resists movement, the other is always moving, invisibly, just enough to stay exactly where it needs to be. Here's the little-known fact that makes this even more remarkable. During the Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, the rig's dynamic positioning system was still running in the final moments before the explosion. When the blowout occurred, the uncontrolled gas rushing up through the hull disrupted the thrusters, and without position-holding capability, the situation became unrecoverable. DP wasn't a footnote in that disaster, it was a central factor. A system designed to prevent catastrophe had its own invisible vulnerability. Which brings us back to the anchor, the humble, ancient iron hook. In harbors and shallow coastlines, it still does exactly what it's always done. The geometry works, the chain lies flat, the flukes bite in. But the moment you push past a certain depth, the anchor becomes a metaphor more than a mechanism. What actually holds the world's most critical offshore infrastructure in place is not grip or weight or buried metal. It is computation, constant, relentless, invisible computation, firing jets of water against the sea itself over and over to win a battle against physics that never ends. The next time you see a ship sitting motionless in deep water, seemingly calm and anchored against the sea, know this: it isn't resting, it's fighting, every second, in every direction, and the only thing keeping it still is a system smart enough to never stop moving.